Verse 9. Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles. So you wanna save the Gentiles? The Lord is telling you this. He wants you to proclaim ye this among them. Go tell them this. Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles. Prepare war. That's what the Lord is going to do. That's what he's going to give the Gentile. He told them, prepare war. Then he says, wake up the mighty men. Yeah, go tell the Gentiles to wake up their mighty men and get ready. And then it says, let all the men of war draw near. Yo, go tell the Gentiles that. It says, let all the men of war draw near. Go tell them that. Tell them to come near. Let's have it. Then he says, let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords. So if you're a farmer and you got a plowshare, beat it into a sword. Get ready, because war is coming. And your pruning hooks into spears. Yeah, make them spears. Let the weak say, I am strong. So even the weak of you Gentiles, say you are strong and come, let's have it. That's what the Lord is saying. Verse 11. Assemble yourselves and come, all ye heathen. Come on, heathen. Let's have it. You hear that? And gather yourselves together round about. Thither cause thy mighty ones to come down, O Lord. So you have your Gentiles come, because the Lord is going to get his mighty ones to come down. So to you Gentiles, get your mighty ones to come down. Thither cause thy mighty ones to come down, O Lord. So the Lord is going to cause his mighty ones to come down. Verse 12. Let the heathen be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about. So that's when the Lord is going to utterly destroy all the Gentiles in the valley of Jehoshaphat. So if you want to tell the Gentiles something, tell them that. Go ahead, tell them that.
Historical fact. Joel was written around 537 BC, just after the Jews returned from Babylon. In the 12th verse, he ends up saying that the passage is about the retaliation that was a threat This passage is about God's retaliation was his threat to Tyre and Zidon for carrying the riches of the Jews into their pagan temples and selling the children of Judah to the Greeks. All of this was clearly stated in the 4th verse. There is more historical events surrounding Joel's prophecy, but it's plain enough to already see that his interpretation of this passage is way out of sync with the events and times. Why is this? Because he thinks these prophecies have not come to pass, because every prophecy that he reads or that has already come to pass, he ignores it and applies it to himself and his kind to these prophecies that have already come to pass, which means all who believe like this are waiting for nothing and interpret any modern day event to these passages.
So that's when the Lord is going to utterly destroy all the Gentiles.
Is this a proper way to interpret scripture? Again, that's up to you to believe. This is a disrespect and self-centered way of interpreting scripture, and it makes God's specific word against Tyre and Zidon generic and inaccurate, which I know God is never inaccurate and never generic. But the man interpreting this passage is wrong in every possible way. So again, who are you going to believe? Old Testament prophets backed by historical accounts and uncontrolled events, or a personal interpretation of scripture backed by absolutely nothing from the mouth of men who ignore all of the above?
These 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So the Lord told him to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and says, and as ye go, preach, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So he's supposed to preach the kingdom of heaven at hand to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So
you say that the quote other sheep in John is the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Let's take a look at the reasoning here. So the Gentiles spoken of are lost Israelites, but Jesus just said, go not into the way, meaning region, of the Gentiles. Furthermore, he says that the other lost sheep are the same, or the other sheep are the same as lost sheep. So if they're the same, then Jesus just contradicted himself if we go with what you believe and say. The Israelites are spread out into many foreign nations. But if Jesus said go not into the way of the Gentiles or Samaritans, then where are the lost sheep of the house of Israel located at? Plainly, the lost sheep were in their midst, among the nations of Israel, like Jesus said they were. These lost sheep were among the house of Israel, who were already Jews, and especially if they already knew who the Jews were, since Jesus and his disciples never labeled them as Gentiles. So no matter which road you take, your argument falls apart, because these Gentiles you say are called Jews cannot be found in Scripture, and even worse, no one in the Bible even hints to this at all, neither plainly, not even to the smallest degree. The best we can do with this is that Jesus acknowledges that some Jews have in reality lost their tribal identity of one of the 12 tribes. Since they are of the house of Israel, it's obviously they know they're Jews, but they probably don't know what tribe they're from. Some Hebrews actually lost their tribal identity. It's plain to see that the lost sheep were a specific group located in Judea among the Jews, or among the house of Israel, that Jesus said did not go into the region of Samaria, which is, the region of the north. The nations must be referring to Galilee. Also in the north, you can see Galilee of the nations in Isaiah, and also in Matthew chapter 4, it talks about Galilee of the nations. Of course, this was a temporary mandate until Jesus' resurrection, or rejection, death, and resurrection was complete. But that's another story. If Jesus said, "Go not into the way of the Gentiles," then how are the disciples supposed to reach the lost sheep if you all are insisting they are among the way of the Gentiles? You're saying that, they're among the Gentiles, but he's saying don't go not in the way of the Gentiles. So if we're to take the way that you're using Scripture, it's actually contradicting what Jesus is actually saying, if we're trying to be consistent in who these Gentiles really are. If we just go plainly what the text is saying, then obviously there's one set of Gentiles, and later on we'll cover how there's one set of Gentiles, but they're using two words to describe one set of Gentiles, not two types of Gentiles like the Black Hebrew Israelites want you to believe. Remember, it is not until years later in Acts chapter 13, verse 46 and 49, that God specifically allows Paul and Barnabas to focus on the Gentiles. Let me deal with John chapter 10, verse 16 again. The quote, "other" is an adjective according to the Greek word allos, which means alternate or additional. A fold is an enclosure for sheep or group with a common interest. The Greek word for fold is aule, meaning flock. And it is a noun, which means it is a person, place, or thing. A sheep actually, usually means follower. And a shepherd means leader. So what was Jesus actually saying? Basically this: I have additional followers which are not of your group. The question now is, how can you call the lost sheep of the house of Israel an additional group if they are already a part of Israel, like Jesus is saying? So obviously when he's using the word sheep and additional sheep and others, obviously Israel does not fulfill that. Somebody else does. And obviously if we just go plainly with what the text is saying, it is the Gentiles, and the pieces fit perfectly like a nice puzzle. The bottom line is, Jesus was not using sheep as an exclusive term for Israel. Rather, he was using it as an exclusive term for his followers. To further prove my point, I'll read the same chapter of John, where Jesus ends up talking to the Jews and says, "But if you believe not because you are not of my sheep." This does not mean that the Jews are not of his sheep, but it means if someone is a real follower, they will, quote, "hear my voice, and I know them, and they know me." And of course, this shows that you cannot do any eisegesis on to interpret a text, because you can apply it to, what you see fit, instead of leaving the text there to allow historical facts surrounding the time to tell the story like any true seeker should. As you can see, isolating a text can cause error. The following is a very good example of this.
"Whither will he go that we shall not find him? Will he go unto the dispersed, among the Gentiles. So even our people, even we knew that there was a dispersed that were among the Gentiles. That's why the prophet Nehemiah said, remember. Guess what? They remembered. That's why they're saying this. It says, then said the Jews among themselves, because they remember what the prophet Nehemiah said, to remember what Moses said, whither will he go that we shall not find him? Will he go into the dispersed among the Gentiles and teach the Gentiles? So he says, will he go into the dispersed among the Gentiles and teach the Gentiles? Who are these Gentiles? These Gentiles talking about Israelites, because these dispersed that are among the Gentiles are known as Gentiles, because they have adopted Gentile ways. They have adopted Gentile customs. They have adopted Gentile tongues and speeches and languages. So the Israelites who are keeping the laws and were in Jerusalem were saying, no, we don't deal with them. They Gentiles.
We have in John chapter 7, verse 35. The word translated in the King James Version for Gentiles is not ethnos, but it is rather Helen. Now we already discovered what Helen means. We already covered it. It means Greeks. Helen means Greeks. Hellene, Greeks. We covered that earlier. Why did the writer of John do this? Again, the first question that should be asked is, why did John specifically use Helen instead of ethnos if Greeks were Gentiles too? Because specifically he was talking about the Greeks, the people that the Jews were scattered among. We just read in the book of Joel how the Jews were sold to the Greeks in the Old Testament. Greece was the closest place where the Jews were scattered. They knew where a great amount of Jewish brethren were. The Pharisees, speaking in John's book, acknowledges this. Not just any old nation. They knew where their brothers and sisters were. Like the King James Version implies, the word translated as dispersed is diaspora. So literally the verse should be translated, will he go into the diaspora among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? Obviously, it doesn't take much knowledge to understand what you're claiming. It's pretty much like this. If it's bad reference, then it's natural Gentiles. If it's a good reference, then it's Israel. My friend, this is not sound doctrine. It requires blind belief to accept what you're pushing as the truth. This is not biblical interpretation. These are passages that are inconsistent with your doctrine, and you have to insert your interpretation into the passage and pass it on as interpretation, because you can't find a text that plainly agrees with your doctrine without you having to interpret the text.
In the parts of Libya and Cyrene and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes. Strangers of Rome. Those who knew they were Jews and those who were Gentiles and were converted, which means they were Israelites and they were living as Gentiles. They were Greeks who, as we read, took Greek as their tongue and adopted Greek ideas and customs. Okay, they heard everybody in their own tongue. Again, in verse 11 it says, Cretes and Arabians, we do hear them speak.
Acts chapter 2 verse 5 through 11. Again, you are now replacing the actual meaning of the words and the writer's use of the words and replacing it with your interpretation of the text. That doesn't even match the way the writer is using the words in the passage. Strangers of Rome is what he says. Then he says Jews and proselytes. Proselytes are Gentiles who converted to becoming Jews. All right, this is probably one of the highlights of the video, so listen up. Even when Jesus mentioned proselytes in the Gospel of Matthew, well, I'll let you hunt that down for homework for yourself. It proves that Jews have been doing this since the Old Testament, and the term proselyte is nowhere found in the New Testament, but they still proselyted, or in other words, converted non-Jewish people to Jews. Check Esther chapter 8 verse 17 in the Old Testament, where many of their enemies became Jews. How did they become Jews? All of the following can be found with 100% proven accuracy consistently throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. I will give references, probably in the description box of this video, or I'll probably just slap it in the video itself at some later on time.